Most people think going back to the moon should be easy. We did it in the 1960s. Grainy footage, a flag in the dust, case closed, right? But Brian Cox says that idea completely misunderstands how spaceflight actually works. Because the moon didn't suddenly become harder to reach. We didn't simply forget how to go. What disappeared was the world that made it possible. The technology faded, the skills vanished, the system collapsed under its own weight. And when you trace what was lost, piece by piece, a disturbing thought emerges. The moon didn't get farther away, we did. Welcome to Simulation Hypothesis. This is where we slow down and question the stories we've been told about humanity, Earth, and our place in deep time. We don't chase fantasy or ancient alien myths here. We follow uncomfortable science, real hypotheses, and the kinds of questions scientists ask when they stop assuming humans are special by default. If this kind of thinking pulls you in, stay with us, subscribe, and let's examine a version of Earth that might be far stranger than we're taught. What most people miss when they talk about going back to the moon is that they imagine spaceflight like riding a bicycle. Once you learn it, you never forget. The assumption is that Apollo was a skill humanity unlocked, stored somewhere in a filing cabinet labeled achievements, and can simply pull out again whenever motivation returns. Brian Cox argues that this intuition is deeply wrong. Because Apollo wasn't just a mission, it was a temporary alignment of politics, economics, engineering culture, industrial capacity, and human risk tolerance that has never existed before or since. The moon landings weren't the natural result of technological progress. They were an anomaly, a spike in history so extreme that it distorted what came after it. In the 1960s, the United States wasn't trying to build a sustainable space program. It was trying to win a geopolitical confrontation. The Cold War created a situation where cost didn't matter, inefficiency didn't matter, and long-term planning barely mattered. What mattered was speed and symbolism. Beating the Soviet Union to the moon wasn't about exploration. It was about demonstrating dominance in physics, engineering, and industrial scale. That distinction matters more than people realize. Apollo consumed nearly 4% of the entire U.S. federal budget at its peak. Today, NASA operates on less than half of 1%. That difference isn't cosmetic, it's existential. The Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful machine ever built, was not optimized for reuse, sustainability, or cost efficiency. It was optimized to work once perfectly under extreme urgency. And it did. But the moment the political pressure disappeared, the justification for that kind of spending vanished with it. Brian Cox often emphasizes that modern space agencies are judged by a completely different metric: efficiency, safety, public accountability, and long-term value. Apollo ignored all four. The Saturn V alone required a manufacturing ecosystem that no longer exists. Entire factories were built solely to produce single-use components. Tens of thousands of engineers worked on narrowly specialized subsystems that were never intended to be reused or upgraded. When Apollo ended, those people retired, moved industries, or passed away. Their knowledge wasn't written down in neat manuals. Much of it lived in intuition, experience, and muscle memory. Spaceflight at that level is not just about blueprints. It's about tacit knowledge, knowing how metal behaves when stressed beyond safety margins, knowing which tolerances can be violated and which cannot, knowing how to diagnose problems in systems that were never fully tested on Earth. That kind of knowledge decays faster than technology itself. Brian Cox has pointed out that even if you had every original Apollo schematic, rebuilding the program wouldn't mean recreating Apollo. It would mean building something fundamentally different, under modern constraints, modern safety standards, and modern political realities. And that's where the illusion collapses. The moon hasn't become unreachable because of physics. It's become unreachable because modern civilization no longer tolerates the kind of risk Apollo required. Astronauts during Apollo accepted survival odds that would be politically unthinkable today. A single failure didn't just risk lives, it risked national humiliation. Yet missions launched anyway. Today, one fatal accident can shut down a program for years. Brian Cox doesn't frame this as cowardice. He frames it as maturity. Modern societies value human life differently. We no longer see astronauts as expendable symbols. We see them as individuals whose deaths carry moral, political, and psychological consequences. That changes everything. Apollo hardware was pushed beyond conservative limits because delay was unacceptable. Today, delay is the default. Every system must be tested, retested, simulated, audited, and certified across layers of bureaucracy. Each step improves safety, but also stretches timelines into decades. This is why going back to the moon isn't repetition, it's reinvention. And reinvention is harder than invention. There's another uncomfortable truth Brian Cox returns to again and again. Apollo didn't prove we could live on the moon. It proved we could visit it briefly. Staying is an entirely different problem, one Apollo never even tried to solve. The moon is not Mars-like. It has no atmosphere worth speaking of, no magnetic field, no protection from cosmic radiation or solar storms. Temperatures swing hundreds of degrees between day and night. Lunar dust is electrostatically charged, abrasive, toxic to lungs, and invasive to machinery. Apollo astronauts stayed for hours or days. A permanent presence means surviving indefinitely in an environment that actively degrades both machines and bodies. Which brings us to the most misunderstood part of space exploration: biology. Brian Cox stresses that the limiting factor of human spaceflight is not propulsion. It's the human organism. Our bodies evolved under one gravity, one radiation environment, one atmospheric pressure, and one magnetic shield. Remove any of those, and the system starts failing in subtle but compounding ways. On the moon, gravity is 1/6 of Earth's. That sounds manageable until you consider decades of exposure. Bones weaken, muscles atrophy, cardiovascular systems adapt in ways that may not be reversible. We don't even know what human reproduction looks like in that environment because ethically, we've never tested it. A lunar colony would not be an extension of Earth. It would be a fragile, artificial bubble requiring constant resupply, constant maintenance, and constant vigilance against failure. Every breath would be engineered, every calorie accounted for, every illness magnified by isolation. Apollo avoided all of this by leaving quickly. Modern missions can't. Brian Cox argues that this is why robotic exploration has quietly overtaken human exploration in scientific value. Robots don't need air. They don't suffer radiation sickness. They don't care about gravity. They don't panic, age, or rebel. For pure science, robots outperform humans at a fraction of the cost and risk. So why send humans at all? Because the moon isn't about science anymore. It's about narrative. Nations don't want lunar data. They want presence, flags, permanence, proof of capability. The moon has become a symbolic battleground again, but this time without the singular urgency that once justified reckless ambition. And without urgency, complexity wins. Every proposed lunar program today collapses under competing goals. Scientific research competes with commercial interests. National pride competes with international cooperation. Safety competes with speed. Budgets compete with public opinion. Apollo had one goal. Modern spaceflight has dozens. Brian Cox has described Apollo as a magnificent aberration, not a foundation, not a template, an exception. Treating it as a baseline sets unrealistic expectations and distorts how we judge modern missions. The uncomfortable implication is this: we didn't abandon the moon because we failed. We abandoned it because the conditions that allowed us to go no longer exist. And recreating those conditions may require something modern civilization resists: sacrifice without immediate return. As this realization sinks in, the moon starts to look less like a destination and more like a mirror. It reflects what kind of society we were when we reached it, and what kind of society we are now. We didn't lose the moon because of distance or difficulty. We lost it because we changed, but that's not all. Once you accept that Apollo was a historical anomaly, the next uncomfortable layer begins to reveal itself. Because even if money suddenly stopped being a problem tomorrow, even if governments agreed to pour Apollo-level funding back into lunar exploration, Brian Cox argues that we would still not be going back in the way people imagine. We would be doing something fundamentally different, under fundamentally different rules. One of the least discussed reasons the moon feels unreachable today is that modern engineering culture has changed at its core. Apollo-era engineering was fast, hierarchical, and brutally pragmatic. Decisions were made by small groups of people with authority to accept enormous risk. Failure was tolerated as long as it moved the program forward. Engineers didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for good enough to fly. That mindset no longer exists. Today's aerospace systems are designed to be audited, certified, litigated, insured, and politically defended. Every component must justify itself not only to physics, but to committees, regulators, oversight boards, and public opinion. This isn't a flaw, it's a reflection of how advanced societies protect lives and resources, but it makes Apollo-style execution almost impossible. Brian Cox often points out that when people say, "We've lost the technology," what they really mean is, we've lost the ability to take that kind of risk. The Saturn V was not safe by modern standards. It was powerful, elegant, and terrifying. Entire stages were discarded into the ocean. Redundancy was limited. Testing was incomplete. The rocket flew because engineers trusted theory, intuition, and experience more than exhaustive verification. Modern rockets are safer but slower to develop, slower to certify, and slower to fly. That trade-off matters when your destination is the moon. Because the moon is not forgiving. Unlike low Earth orbit, where astronauts can be rescued within hours or days, the moon is far enough away that mistakes compound rapidly. Communication delays are small but real. Resupply is expensive. Abort options are limited. Every failure mode must be anticipated in advance. Apollo accepted that some things could not be anticipated. Modern missions cannot. Brian Cox frames this as a psychological shift as much as a technical one. Apollo astronauts were test pilots first and scientists second. They were trained to expect systems to fail and to improvise solutions under pressure. Modern astronauts are closer to operators of highly automated systems. Their job is to monitor, execute procedures, and intervene only when absolutely necessary. That's not a criticism. It's a consequence of how complex systems have become. But it means human adaptability, once a strength, has been traded for predictability. On the moon, unpredictability is everywhere. The lunar surface is not passive. Dust infiltrates seals, joints, electronics, and lungs. Temperature extremes fatigue materials. Radiation damages cells and circuits alike. Micrometeorites strike without warning. Even walking stirs up electrically charged particles that cling to everything. Apollo astronauts experienced these problems briefly. A long-term presence would experience them continuously. And this leads to another illusion Brian Cox dismantles, the idea that the moon is a stepping stone. People often say we should return to the moon to practice for Mars, but in many ways the moon is a worse training ground for human survival. Mars has an atmosphere, however thin. It has weather. It has some shielding from radiation. The moon has almost nothing. Living on the moon would require constructing sealed environments that are closer to space stations than planetary habitats. Every habitat would be an island. Every failure would be existential. Which raises the question, why risk humans at all? Brian Cox is blunt here. From a purely scientific perspective, humans add very little that robots cannot do better, cheaper, and longer. The moon has already been mapped extensively. Its composition is well understood. Its geology is ancient and relatively static. There are no ecosystems to study, no biology to explore, no dynamic processes that demand human presence. Human missions to the moon are not about discovery anymore. They are about demonstration. Demonstration of capability, of prestige, of continuity with the past. And that creates a dangerous tension. When missions are designed to symbolize something rather than accomplish something, they become politically fragile. Budgets fluctuate, priorities shift, administrations change. A single accident can transform public enthusiasm into public backlash overnight. Apollo ended not because it failed, but because its symbolic purpose expired. Brian Cox reminds audiences that once the moon was won, there was no compelling reason to keep paying the price. The scientific returns didn't justify the cost. The political returns diminished. The risks remained. So the program was quietly dismantled. Factories shut down, tooling was scrapped, engineers dispersed, knowledge diffused into other industries. What remained were photographs, footage, and a collective myth that the hardest part was already done. It was. Another layer often ignored is energy infrastructure. Apollo relied on an industrial base powered by cheap fossil fuels, massive manufacturing throughput, and a workforce trained in hands-on fabrication. Modern spaceflight exists in a world where supply chains are global, specialized, and fragile. A single missing component can delay a launch for years. Brian Cox emphasizes that spaceflight does not scale like software. You cannot iterate quickly. You cannot patch later. Hardware lives in the real world, governed by thermodynamics, materials science, and human limitations. Which brings us to the moon's most unforgiving constraint, time. Not mission time, human time. The moon operates on a 2-week day-night cycle, 2 weeks of continuous sunlight, followed by 2 weeks of darkness. During lunar night, temperatures plummet to levels that challenge even hardened equipment. Energy storage becomes a nightmare. Nuclear power solves some problems but introduces others, political, logistical, and ethical. Apollo missions avoided lunar night entirely. Permanent habitation cannot. Brian Cox often notes that people imagine a lunar base as a static outpost. In reality, it would be a constantly fighting organism, expending enormous energy just to remain alive. Maintenance would dominate existence. Exploration would be secondary. And then there's the psychological dimension. Isolation on Earth is already difficult. Isolation on the moon would be absolute. No rescue, no evacuation, no immediate return. Astronauts would live knowing that every system they depend on was built months or years ago, far away, by people who cannot help them now. We have some data from Antarctica, submarines, and space stations. None of it suggests humans thrive under those conditions indefinitely. Brian Cox doesn't romanticize this. He treats it as biology colliding with environment. Humans are adaptable, but not infinitely. This is why modern lunar plans increasingly blur into something else: automation, telepresence, and remote operation. Humans remain nearby, perhaps in orbit, while machines do the dangerous work. Presence without exposure, control without embodiment. And when you follow that logic to its conclusion, the moon becomes less of a destination and more of a relay point, which leads to a quiet but profound shift in how we define exploration. If humans don't need to physically stand somewhere for science to happen, what does going back even mean? Brian Cox argues that the obsession with human footprints distracts from a more important question. What kind of future are we actually building in space? A future of symbolic repetition, or a future optimized for survival, understanding, and continuity? Because the moon doesn't care about nostalgia. It doesn't reward ambition. It doesn't punish hesitation. It simply enforces physics. And physics is indifferent to history. As we move forward, the idea of returning to the moon starts to look less like a continuation and more like a fork in the road. One path chases the past. The other acknowledges that the past cannot be recreated, only reinterpreted. The next layer is where this becomes truly unsettling. Because if the moon is not unreachable due to distance, funding, or technology, but due to who we have become, then the question isn't whether we can go back. It's whether we should even want to. A quite interesting statement, right? Well, that should be the least of our problems when thinking about the moon. First, when you stop seeing the moon as a destination and start seeing it as a stress test, the conversation changes in a subtle but uncomfortable way. Because the moon doesn't just challenge our technology, it exposes the limits of our biology in a way Earth never does. And this is where Brian Cox becomes especially careful with his language, because the problem here isn't dramatic. It's slow, quiet, and unavoidable. The human body evolved inside a very narrow environmental window, one atmosphere of pressure, a thick magnetic field, constant gravity, a protective blanket of air and ozone. Every system in your body, your bones, blood, immune response, even how your brain processes time, assumes those conditions are permanent. On Earth, you can break machines and still survive. In space, the machine is your environment. On the moon, that reality becomes impossible to ignore. Unlike Earth, the moon has no global magnetic field. That means there is nothing to deflect charged particles streaming from the sun or arriving from deep space as cosmic rays. On Earth, these particles are mostly harmless because they're absorbed or deflected before reaching the surface. On the moon, they pass straight through. Brian Cox often points out that radiation in space isn't a one-time danger. It's a constant background assault. Every hour adds damage. Every day increases cancer risk. Every month compounds genetic stress. Apollo astronauts were exposed briefly, days, not years. Even then, some doses were dangerously close to modern safety limits. A permanent lunar presence would mean exposure measured not in missions, but in lifetimes. Shielding helps, but shielding has mass. Mass costs energy. Energy costs infrastructure. And infrastructure on the moon is brutally expensive to build and maintain. You don't just stack concrete and steel. You must fabricate materials locally or transport them across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of vacuum. So habitats would likely be buried under regolith. Underground living becomes the default, not a contingency. And that has consequences no engineering diagram can fully capture. Humans living underground for extended periods experience changes in sleep cycles, mood regulation, cognitive performance, and emotional stability. Even on Earth, isolation and confinement produce measurable psychological strain. On the moon, there is no outside world to reconnect with. No sky, no wind, no living ecosystems. Brian Cox is careful not to dramatize this, but the data is relentless. Humans are not designed for sealed existence. Then there's gravity. Lunar gravity is about 1/6 of Earth's. That sounds harmless, even fun, until you realize what gravity does quietly every second of your life. It loads your bones. It maintains muscle tone. It regulates fluid distribution. It provides resistance that your cardiovascular system relies on. In microgravity, astronauts lose bone density and muscle mass rapidly, even with constant exercise. The moon offers some gravity, but not enough to stop long-term degradation. We don't have data for humans living at 1/6 gravity for years, because no one ever has. Brian Cox emphasizes this uncertainty as one of the most dangerous aspects of lunar optimism, not because it's scary, but because it's unknown. And unknowns are lethal in environments where failure has no margin. If children were ever born on the moon, their skeletal development would be radically different. Returning to Earth might be impossible. Even standing upright could become painful or fatal. Humanity would fracture biologically, not culturally. Which raises a disturbing question. Are we prepared to create a version of humanity that cannot come home? This is not science fiction. This is a direct implication of long-term off-world habitation. Brian Cox doesn't speculate emotionally about it. He simply follows the physics and biology to their logical end. And the moon accelerates that divergence faster than anywhere else. Then comes the issue people rarely want to discuss: accidents. On Earth, accidents happen in layers. If one system fails, others compensate. If a building loses power, emergency systems activate. If something goes wrong, help arrives. On the moon, accidents cascade. A micrometeorite puncture, a seal failure, a power loss during lunar night, a communication glitch. Any one of these can become fatal within minutes. And because everything is interconnected, small failures propagate rapidly. Brian Cox often says that space environments don't forgive complexity. The more systems you add, the more failure modes you create. Simplicity is survival, but simplicity limits capability. This is why early lunar bases would not look like cities. They would look like fragile, temporary installations that exist in a constant state of triage. Which brings us to logistics. Every kilogram launched from Earth costs enormous energy. Every spare part, every tool, every medical supply must be anticipated years in advance. You cannot run to the store on the moon. You cannot improvise materials easily. Manufacturing in vacuum, low gravity, and extreme temperatures is still largely theoretical. Brian Cox points out that Earth's industrial power relies on scale, redundancy, and flexibility. None of those exist on the moon. A lunar base would be closer to a stranded expedition than a growing settlement. And settlements don't thrive when resupply is fragile. This fragility changes incentives. Risk tolerance drops. Innovation slows. Caution dominates. Exploration becomes procedural, not adventurous. Ironically, the more we try to make the moon safe, the more static it becomes. And then there's the political dimension. Apollo succeeded because it was driven by a singular geopolitical goal. That goal no longer exists. Modern lunar missions must justify themselves across decades, administrations, and shifting public priorities. That makes them vulnerable. Brian Cox often reminds people that space programs don't fail because of physics. They fail because of patience. Long-term projects require sustained belief, and belief is harder to maintain when returns are intangible, slow, and distant, especially when Earth itself faces crises that feel more immediate. Climate change, resource scarcity, social instability. Against that backdrop, the moon looks less like destiny and more like indulgence, which leads to a quiet but critical realization. The reason we haven't gone back isn't because we forgot how. It's because the cost, biological, psychological, logistical, and political, is now understood more clearly than it was in the 1960s. Apollo was a leap taken in partial ignorance. Today, we know too much to leap blindly. Brian Cox doesn't argue that returning to the moon is impossible in principle. He argues that the version of return people imagine, routine, sustainable, human-centered, collides with realities we cannot engineer away. The moon is not hostile out of malice. It is hostile by indifference. And indifference is harder to fight than opposition. As this becomes clearer, the narrative begins to shift again, away from permanence, away from habitation, towards something colder but more honest. The moon as a laboratory, a proving ground, a place we visit briefly, deliberately, and rarely, not a place we belong. And once you accept that, another uncomfortable implication follows. If even the moon resists us this strongly, what does that say about Mars? That's where this thread leads next, not as a jump, but as a continuation of the same logic. And if you admit that the moon resists permanent human presence at every level, the question quietly transforms. It's no longer, why haven't we gone back? But what kind of universe did we mistake this for? Because the deeper Brian Cox pushes into this topic, the clearer it becomes that our failure isn't about ambition or courage, it's about misunderstanding scale. We grew up with a very Earth-shaped intuition. On Earth, distance is annoying but solvable. Harsh environments exist, but they're local. If something goes wrong, help is somewhere, maybe far, maybe slow, but real. The moon shatters that intuition. It forces us to confront a version of reality where distance isn't just physical, but existential. The moon is close in astronomical terms, but operationally, it might as well be a different universe. 3 days away sounds manageable until you realize what those 3 days represent. No rescue, no rapid evacuation, no margin. Every decision must assume that failure is final. Brian Cox often points out that spaceflight is not an extension of aviation, it's an entirely different category of risk. Airplanes fail and people survive. Space systems fail and everyone dies. Apollo astronauts accepted that risk because the mission duration was short. They weren't building lives. They weren't raising families. They weren't planning decades of exposure. Modern proposals quietly assume something Apollo never did: normalization. Normalization is the dangerous step. The moment you talk about returning to the moon as if it's routine, you imply repeatability, schedules, habitats, long-term occupation, and that's where the physics tightens its grip. Consider temperature. On Earth, temperature fluctuates within a narrow range. On the moon, it's violent. During lunar day, surface temperatures can exceed 120 degrees C. During lunar night, they can drop below -170 degrees C. That swing doesn't happen gradually, it's abrupt and relentless. Materials expand and contract, electronics degrade, seals weaken, metal fatigues, lubricants freeze or vaporize. Even the most advanced systems suffer when exposed repeatedly. Brian Cox emphasizes that engineering for space isn't about surviving extremes once, It's about surviving them forever, and nothing humans build lasts forever under those conditions. This leads to quiet truth, rarely spoken in mission briefings. Maintenance on the moon is harder than construction. On Earth, maintenance relies on access, spare parts, skilled labor, and flexibility. On the moon, maintenance means working in vacuum suits, under radiation in low gravity with limited tools, knowing that a torn glove or cracked visor is fatal. That reality shapes behavior. Risk aversion increases. Innovation slows. Every repair becomes a calculated gamble. Over time, systems become brittle not because they're poorly designed, but because the environment punishes complexity. And then there's dust. Lunar dust is unlike anything on Earth. It's sharp, abrasive, electrostatically charged, and invasive. It clings to suits, penetrates seals, scratches optics, and degrades machinery. Apollo astronauts reported it causing respiratory irritation and mechanical wear after just days. Now imagine decades. Brian Cox often uses this example to make a broader point. Environments don't need to be dramatic to be lethal. They only need to be persistent. The moon's dust doesn't attack you. It slowly dismantles your tools. And this is where the economic illusion collapses. People often argue that we could build infrastructure gradually, spreading costs over time. But gradual building only works when environments allow accumulation. The moon erodes accumulation. Every year you spend maintaining a lunar base is a year not spent expanding it. Earth cities grow because maintenance is cheap relative to growth. On the moon, maintenance is the growth, which leads to energy. Solar power sounds ideal until you confront lunar night, 2 weeks of darkness, no sunlight, extreme cold, batteries struggle, nuclear options raise mass, safety, and political concerns. Energy storage becomes a central vulnerability. Brian Cox notes that energy scarcity isn't just about power, it's about time. If systems shut down, they don't just pause, they degrade, pipes freeze, electronics crack, habitats die. Restarting after failure may be impossible. That makes redundancy essential, but redundancy increases mass. Mass increases launch cost. Launch cost limits redundancy. The moon becomes a closed loop of constraints. Then there's communication. The moon is close enough for near real-time contact, but even that introduces psychological strain. Astronauts on the ISS experience isolation despite constant communication and Earth views. On the moon, Earth is visible but unreachable, a constant reminder of separation. Brian Cox has spoken about this paradox. Seeing Earth may be more psychologically taxing than not seeing it at all. It turns isolation into longing. You're not lost in space, you're exiled just far enough to feel it. Over time, that matters. Human beings are not just biological systems. They're social, emotional, and narrative-driven. We survive by belonging to something larger than ourselves. A lunar base would be small, artificial, and permanently dependent. There is no wilderness to escape into, no horizon that doesn't kill you. And this is where the philosophical shift occurs. The moon was once framed as humanity's next step outward, but Brian Cox increasingly frames it as a mirror, a place that reflects our limits back at us without drama. It doesn't reject us violently, it simply refuses to support us, which forces a reckoning with a deeply ingrained assumption that progress always moves outward. On Earth, expansion solved problems, new lands, new resources, new frontiers. That history shaped our psychology. It taught us that when things get difficult, we move. The moon breaks that pattern. There is nowhere to move to on the moon. Every square meter is equally hostile. There are no fertile valleys, no safer climates, no hidden abundance. Just rock, radiation, vacuum, and time. Brian Cox suggests that this is why lunar optimism feels so seductive. It lets us avoid a harder truth, that humanity's future is constrained not by imagination, but by environment. And the moon is the first place where that becomes undeniable. Which brings us to the deeper implication, the one that makes going back emotionally uncomfortable. If the moon cannot support permanent human presence despite all our technology, then Earth is not just our home. It's our only viable one. That realization changes how you interpret space exploration. It stops being about escape and starts being about understanding, about stewardship, about recognizing rarity. And it reframes the moon not as a destination to conquer, but as a boundary that teaches us humility. Because the moon didn't defeat us. It simply revealed what we are not built for. And that realization doesn't end with the moon. It echoes forward toward Mars, toward deep space, toward every promise of off-world salvation. That's where this logic continues to pull us next. By the time you reach this point in Brian Cox's reasoning, the moon has quietly stopped being the main subject. It has become a case study. Because the real issue isn't that the moon is uniquely hostile, it's that the moon is honest. It exposes constraints that were always there, but easy to ignore when we were distracted by flags, footage, and triumph. And once you see those constraints clearly, something uncomfortable happens. You realize that the Apollo era wasn't the beginning of a future, it was an anomaly. The moon landing worked not because it was sustainable, but because it was unsustainable by design. Apollo succeeded because it was short, focused, massively overfunded, and politically insulated from normal reality. It didn't have to last. It didn't have to grow. It didn't have to justify itself for decades. It only had to work once a few times under extraordinary conditions. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Brian Cox often explains that physics doesn't care about symbolism. It cares about repetition. Anything that works once is irrelevant. Anything that works reliably is what counts. And spaceflight fails that test the moment you remove urgency. When the Cold War ended, the justification collapsed, the funding normalized, the risk tolerance dropped, the institutional momentum evaporated. What remained was physics, unchanged, unbothered, and unforgiving. This is why the idea of just going back misunderstands history. Apollo was not a prototype of the future. It was a detour from reality. And reality reasserted itself quickly. The moon didn't become harder to reach. We stopped living in a world willing to throw unlimited resources at a single objective with no expectation of long-term payoff. Brian Cox points out that modern civilization is optimized for continuity, not spectacle. Everything today must justify itself economically, politically, socially, and ethically, year after year. The moon cannot do that. It produces nothing essential. It generates no immediate return. It demands constant investment while offering no natural growth. On Earth, cities grow because they attract people, resources, and innovation organically. On the moon, growth must be forced, shipped in, maintained, defended against entropy. And entropy always wins. This is where the concept of systems collapse quietly enters the discussion. Any long-term lunar presence would be one of the most complex systems humans have ever attempted to maintain. Life support, power generation, radiation shielding, supply chains, medical care, communication, governance, all operating perfectly, continuously, without pause. On Earth, complexity is buffered by redundancy and environment. On the moon, complexity is exposed. One failure doesn't cause inconvenience. It cascades. Brian Cox emphasizes that complex systems fail nonlinearly. They don't degrade gently. They hold together until they suddenly don't, and then recovery becomes impossible. A broken pump on Earth is a repair. A broken pump on the moon is a death sentence. And that changes human behavior in ways that are subtle but profound. Risk aversion increases. Innovation slows. Decision-making becomes conservative. Exploration gives way to survival. The moon doesn't inspire expansion, it enforces caution. Which leads to another misconception, that automation will solve the problem. People often argue that robots can do what humans can't, and to a degree that's true. Robots don't breathe, they don't suffer radiation sickness, they don't experience isolation. But Brian Cox makes an important distinction. Robots extend observation, not habitation. Robots don't create culture. They don't build societies. They don't need futures. Robotic missions succeed precisely because they don't pretend the moon is livable. They accept it as hostile and work around that hostility by minimizing presence. Humans, by contrast, demand an environment that supports not just survival, but meaning. A human mission that doesn't allow growth, family, autonomy, and psychological health is not a civilization. It's a prolonged emergency. And emergencies exhaust people. This is where lunar colonization proposals begin to resemble something else entirely: polar research stations. Antarctica is often used as a comparison. Humans live there, they work there, they survive. But Brian Cox highlights the crucial difference. Antarctica is still Earth. It has air. It has gravity. It has natural ecosystems. It has rescue options. And even then, no one stays permanently. No one raises generations there. No one builds cities. Antarctica is the limit of what humans tolerate, and it's far more forgiving than the moon. So why would the moon succeed where Antarctica does not? The answer is that it wouldn't. The moon offers none of the environmental forgiveness that allows even temporary human presence to feel sustainable. Everything is artificial. Everything is borrowed. Everything is fragile. Which brings us to a deeply unsettling realization Brian Cox keeps circling back to. The problem isn't that we can't go back to the moon. The problem is that we mistook ability for viability. We confuse possible with repeatable. We confuse achieved with sustainable. We confuse historic with practical. The moon landing proved that humans can touch another world. It did not prove that we can live on one. And this confusion shapes how we think about the future. When people talk about Mars, asteroids, or deep space habitats, they inherit the same flawed assumption that success scales. But physics doesn't scale linearly. Every step away from Earth increases dependence on artificial systems. Every layer of protection introduces new failure modes. Every attempt to simulate Earth highlights how irreplaceable it actually is. Brian Cox argues that the moon is the first place where this truth becomes emotionally unavoidable. It's close enough to tempt us, but hostile enough to punish fantasy. And that's why returning to the moon feels harder now than it did 50 years ago. Not because we forgot how to build rockets, not because we lack courage, but because we understand the cost more clearly. Knowledge didn't liberate us. It constrained us. We know more about radiation now. We know more about psychology. We know more about long-term health. We know more about systems failure. Ignorance made Apollo feel heroic. Understanding makes repetition feel reckless, which leads to an uncomfortable question modern space agencies rarely answer directly. If we went back to the moon today, what would we actually do there? Stay briefly, we already know how. Stay longer at enormous cost. Stay permanently, against everything biology, economics, and physics suggest. Brian Cox often frames this as a mismatch between narrative and reality. We tell ourselves stories of expansion because they comfort us. They suggest escape. They suggest destiny. But the universe doesn't care about destiny. It offers conditions, not promises. And the moon's conditions are clear. It will never be a second home. It will never be forgiving. It will never reward permanence, which doesn't mean it's useless. The moon remains invaluable as a scientific archive, a record of early solar system history preserved in vacuum. It's a platform for telescopes, a testbed for robotics, a place to learn briefly under controlled risk. But that role is fundamentally different from colonization. And once you accept that, something shifts. The moon stops being a goal. It becomes a lesson about limits, about humility, about how rare Earth truly is. Brian Cox doesn't argue that humanity should stop exploring. He argues that exploration must evolve from conquest to comprehension. The universe isn't something we move into. It's something we observe from where we belong. And the moon, silent, barren, unyielding, keeps reminding us of that every time we look up and imagine living there. Because the hardest part about returning to the moon isn't getting there. It's accepting that we were never meant to stay. By now, the moon has done something subtle but irreversible to the story. It has stripped away the fantasy that space exploration naturally leads to settlement. And once that illusion is gone, Brian Cox's argument takes a sharper turn, away from engineering and towards something far more uncomfortable: human limits that technology cannot bypass. Because even if you solved every mechanical problem tomorrow, even if rockets were cheap, reusable, and flawless, the most fragile system would still remain unchanged: the human body. Cox often reminds people that we treat the human organism like a flexible platform, as if it can simply adapt to any environment with enough clever design. But evolution doesn't work that way. Our bodies are not general-purpose machines. They are highly specialized biological compromises shaped by a very narrow set of conditions. One planet, one gravity, one atmosphere, one radiation environment, one day-night cycle. Remove any of those, and the body doesn't adapt, it deteriorates. This is where the moon quietly exposes a truth that Mars, asteroids, and deep space will amplify. Humans are not built for off-world living. Start with gravity. On the moon, gravity is about 1/6 of Earth's. That sounds harmless, even fun, until you remember that gravity isn't just something that keeps your feet on the ground. It is a constant signal written into every system of the body. Bones maintain density by resisting gravity. Muscles maintain strength by fighting it. The cardiovascular system relies on it to regulate blood flow. The inner ear uses it to maintain balance and orientation. Take gravity away, and the body begins to unravel. Astronauts on the International Space Station lose bone density at a rate comparable to severe osteoporosis. Muscles weaken despite constant exercise. Vision changes. Fluid shifts upward into the skull. The immune system becomes less effective. And that's after months, not years, not decades. The moon offers no solution here. Artificial gravity would require massive rotating habitats, complex, fragile systems stacked on top of an already hostile environment. Brian Cox emphasizes that biology doesn't care how impressive your engineering looks. If you can't replicate the fundamental forces life evolved under, the cost is paid continuously. Then comes radiation. Earth's magnetic field and thick atmosphere shield us from most cosmic radiation. On the moon, that protection is gone. Solar flares, galactic cosmic rays, and high-energy particles strike the surface unfiltered. Radiation isn't a dramatic killer. It doesn't explode, it accumulates. DNA damage, increased cancer risk, neurological effects, accelerated aging. Shielding helps, but shielding adds mass. Mass adds cost. Cost adds fragility. And shielding can never fully eliminate exposure, only reduce it. Cox points out that long-term radiation exposure isn't something you train for. There is no adaptation. There is only damage management. And then there's isolation. People underestimate how deeply social humans are until isolation stops being optional. On the moon, isolation is absolute. No spontaneous travel. No open environments. No unmediated human contact beyond a tiny group. No natural sensory variation. No wind, no smell, no organic life. Every sound is mechanical. Every view is artificial. Every moment outside safety is lethal. Cox often notes that the psychological cost of this kind of existence is not speculative. We already see it in polar stations, submarines, and long-duration space missions. Depression, cognitive decline, conflict, loss of motivation, and those environments are still connected to Earth. The moon is not, which leads to the next constraint people rarely confront honestly: time without relief. A lunar mission isn't stressful because it's dangerous. It's stressful because it never stops being dangerous. There is no off state. On Earth, danger is intermittent. You recover, you rest, you disengage. On the moon, vigilance is permanent. Every breath is borrowed. Every mistake is final. Every system failure escalates. Brian Cox explains that humans are not psychologically equipped for environment where error tolerance approaches zero. Even elite astronauts, selected for resilience, experience cognitive narrowing under prolonged stress. Creativity drops, flexibility collapses, decisions become rigid. A permanent lunar presence would not create pioneers. It would create caretakers under siege. And caretakers burn out. This is where the conversation shifts again, away from science fiction and toward history. Cox draws parallels not with exploration narratives, but with extreme human experiments that failed quietly. Remote outposts, isolated colonies, systems designed without environmental forgiveness. They don't fail because people are weak. They fail because conditions compound. The moon compounds everything. Which brings us to a realization that undermines almost every popular vision of lunar return. Even if we could build a permanent base, even if we could keep people alive, even if we could fund it, we have no evidence that humans could thrive there. And thriving matters. A civilization isn't defined by survival. It's defined by growth, culture, reproduction, and continuity. The moon actively resists all four. No natural ecosystem. No reproduction studies under lunar gravity. No evidence children could develop normally. No margin for generational error. Brian Cox has said that when you remove Earth from the equation, you're not building a civilization, you're maintaining an experiment. And experiments are meant to end. This reframes the question entirely. The problem isn't why we haven't gone back. The problem is why we assumed going back made sense in the first place. Apollo worked because it ignored everything that makes civilization possible. It bypassed sustainability in favor of achievement. It replaced longevity with spectacle. And spectacle fades. Once the spectacle ended, what remained was reality. Reality says that Earth is not just where we live. It is what we are adapted to. Every attempt to leave it permanently reveals that dependence more clearly, not less. Which leads to a conclusion that feels almost taboo in modern discourse. Space exploration does not mean space habitation. Brian Cox doesn't argue against exploration. He argues against misunderstanding it. Telescopes, probes, short missions, these align with physics and biology. Permanent off-world living does not. The moon teaches this lesson, gently compared to what Mars or deep space would teach brutally. And that's why returning to the moon feels impossible, in a way it didn't in 1969. We're no longer willing to sacrifice people to prove a point. We're no longer willing to ignore consequences. We're no longer willing to pretend survival equals success. Understanding grew. Tolerance shrank. The moon didn't change. We did. And once you accept that, the question stops being, why can't we go back? It becomes something far more unsettling. What does it say about us that the only way we reached the moon was by ignoring everything that makes us human? By this point, the moon has dismantled the fantasy on three levels: technology, biology, and psychology. But there's a deeper layer Brian Cox keeps circling back to, one that people almost never include in space debates, because it doesn't sound scientific enough. Civilization is not portable. We talk about taking humanity to the moon as if humanity were a suitcase, as if you could pack up knowledge, culture, industry, law, and meaning, load it into a rocket, and unpack it somewhere else. But civilization is not an object. It's a process, and that process is inseparable from Earth. Cox often emphasizes that the success of human civilization is not primarily technological. It's ecological. We didn't rise because we had tools. We rose because we existed inside a self-repairing, self-regulating planetary system that absorbed our mistakes. Earth forgives. That forgiveness is invisible because we've never lived without it. On Earth, when a system fails, nature cushions the blow. When crops fail, ecosystems regenerate. When infrastructure collapses, materials weather slowly. When societies falter, the planet keeps providing oxygen, water, pressure, temperature. On the moon, nothing forgives. There is no background system running quietly beneath human activity. There is only what you build, and what you maintain, and what inevitably degrades. This creates a civilization with no slack. Every structure must be perfect. Every system must be redundant. Every human action must be constrained. Every failure compounds. Cox points out that this kind of environment doesn't scale. It doesn't allow creativity, chaos, or growth, the very things that define human societies. A lunar base would not be a city. It would be an operating room. Clean, controlled, sterile, and hostile to anything unpredictable. That includes culture. Culture thrives on excess, extra time, extra space, extra energy. Art, music, philosophy, even scientific creativity emerge when survival is not the dominant concern. On the moon, survival never stops being the dominant concern. There is no off-duty from physics, and that has consequences people don't like to confront. A society that cannot afford inefficiency becomes authoritarian by necessity. Rules must be strict. Deviation must be minimized. Risk-taking must be punished. Not because of ideology, but because error equals death. Brian Cox doesn't frame this as a moral failure. He frames it as a physical inevitability. In an environment with no margin, freedom collapses. That's not speculation. It's observable in every extreme environment humans have ever attempted to inhabit. Submarines, Antarctic stations, space stations. They function, but they do not flourish. And they rely on constant resupply from Earth. Which leads to another illusion the moon quietly destroys: independence. Every serious proposal for a permanent lunar presence eventually runs into the same wall. No matter how advanced the base becomes, it remains dependent. Dependence on Earth for replacement parts, medical expertise, energy-intensive manufacturing, complex electronics, cultural renewal, population replacement. The moon has no industry in the true sense. It has no supply chains that regenerate themselves. Every machine on the moon must be designed, built, and launched from Earth. Cox often highlights this as a fatal misunderstanding. People imagine off-world colonies becoming self-sustaining, but they confuse survival loops with independence. A loop that only works as long as nothing unexpected happens is not sustainable. It's fragile. And fragility increases with time. Radiation degrades materials. Dust infiltrates seals. Temperature cycles crack structures. Human error accumulates. The longer a system runs, the more likely it fails. Earth counters this through redundancy at planetary scale. The moon cannot. Which brings us to an uncomfortable historical parallel. Every civilization that tried to expand into environments fundamentally incompatible with its biology eventually retreated, not because it lacked courage, but because the cost exceeded the benefit. We don't have permanent cities on Everest. We don't have self-sustaining populations in Antarctica. We don't live under the oceans. Not because we can't visit those places, but because visiting is not the same as living. Brian Cox often asks a deceptively simple question. If we won't permanently live in Earth's most hostile environments, why would we expect to thrive in one far worse? The moon is colder than Antarctica, more irradiated than high-altitude deserts, more isolated than submarines, more unforgiving than any place humans evolved to endure. And yet we imagine it as a stepping stone. That imagination survives because we confuse technological achievement with ecological compatibility. Apollo made it look easy because it was brief. Briefness hides costs. Once you stretch time, reality asserts itself, which leads to the next illusion the moon dismantles: progress as inevitability. We like to believe history moves forward by default, that once something is done, it stays doable. That knowledge accumulates smoothly. That capability only increases. Cox pushes back hard against this. He reminds people that progress is not linear, it's conditional. It depends on economic structures, political priorities, cultural motivation, generational continuity, risk tolerance. Apollo existed at a unique intersection of all five. When that intersection dissolved, the capability dissolved with it. Not because the physics changed, because the world changed. The moon didn't move. The constraints didn't relax. The environment didn't soften. Only the willingness to absorb cost disappeared. And that willingness matters. A lunar return that acknowledges all these constraints is not inspiring. It's sobering. It asks people to accept that the moon will never be a place of expansion, only of exposure. Exposure to limits. Exposure to fragility. Exposure to how Earth-centric we truly are. Cox often frames this not as pessimism, but as clarity. The moon is not a destination. It's a mirror. It reflects back everything we take for granted: gravity, atmosphere, protection, abundance, time. Remove those, and civilization doesn't advance. It contracts, which forces the question no one likes to ask. If going back to the moon means building a society that cannot grow, cannot diversify, cannot reproduce safely, and cannot endure without constant Earth support, why go back at all? Not for conquest, not for settlement, not for escape, only for understanding. And understanding doesn't require permanence. It requires humility. This is why Brian Cox consistently reframes humanity's future away from off-world migration and towards something far less glamorous but far more urgent: planetary responsibility. If Earth is the only place civilization works naturally, then abandoning it is not evolution, it's denial. And the moon, silent and unchanged, keeps teaching that lesson every time we pretend otherwise. At this point, the argument tightens into something deeply uncomfortable, because it challenges the motivation people rarely admit out loud: fear. Most modern narratives about returning to the moon or going beyond it are driven by fear disguised as ambition. Fear of extinction, fear of catastrophe, fear that Earth is fragile and temporary, and that survival requires escape. Brian Cox addresses this directly, and he does not soften the message. The moon is often framed as a backup plan, a rehearsal, a foothold, a lifeboat. But lifeboats only work if they float. And the moon doesn't. The idea of a Plan B planet sounds responsible until you examine what planning actually means. Planning requires reliability, predictability, redundancy, margin. Earth has margin. The moon has none. Cox often points out that planetary-scale systems are resilient in ways human-made systems simply cannot replicate. Earth's atmosphere recycles itself. Its magnetic field regenerates. Its oceans buffer temperature. Its biosphere adapts continuously. When something breaks on Earth, the planet absorbs the shock. When something breaks on the moon, humans absorb it. And humans are terrible shock absorbers. This turns the backup plan narrative upside down. If Earth suffers a catastrophe severe enough to threaten civilization, climate collapse, asteroid impact, nuclear war, then the systems required to support a lunar base collapse first. Launch infrastructure fails. Supply chains break. Energy grids destabilize. Political cooperation dissolves. A lunar base is not insulated from Earth's failures. It is amplified by them. Cox frames this as a paradox people don't like to face. The worse Earth gets, the less viable off-world survival becomes. Because space infrastructure is downstream of civilization, not independent of it. The moon depends on Earth being stable. Earth does not depend on the moon at all. This flips the emotional narrative from hope to illusion. You don't escape fragility by moving into a more fragile environment. You don't ensure civilization by placing it inside a system that fails faster. And yet fear keeps pushing the idea forward. Fear is persuasive. Fear sells rockets. Fear sounds rational. But physics is indifferent. Another layer Cox highlights is the timescale mismatch. Even if humanity committed fully, politically, economically, technologically, returning to the moon in a meaningful way takes decades. Building infrastructure takes generations. Stabilizing life support ecosystems takes longer still. Any global catastrophe severe enough to justify abandoning Earth unfolds faster than that. Climate change acts over centuries. Geopolitical instability acts over decades. Pandemics act over years. Asteroid impacts act in minutes. The moon cannot outpace any of them. So the backup logic collapses under time alone, which raises a deeper, more philosophical tension. If the moon cannot save us, and Mars cannot save us, and interstellar travel cannot save us, then what exactly are we running from? Cox often reframes this as a psychological problem, not a scientific one. Humanity has reached a point where its power outpaced its maturity. We can alter planetary systems, but we still think in escape narratives instead of stewardship narratives. The moon becomes a fantasy of avoidance, a way to imagine responsibility somewhere else. But physics refuses to cooperate with avoidance. Every constraint we encounter off-world forces us back to the same conclusion. Earth is not replaceable. Not technologically, not biologically, not culturally, which leads to one of the most misunderstood aspects of Cox's thinking. He is not anti-space. He is anti-self-deception. He supports exploration, science, probes, telescopes, robotics, all of it. What he rejects is the myth that space is an alternative habitat for ordinary humans. Space is a laboratory, a vantage point, a mirror, not a refuge. And the moon is the clearest mirror of all, because it is close enough to touch, yet hostile enough to expose the truth. Every attempt to imagine a thriving lunar society ends in a list of constraints. Every workaround creates new dependencies. Every solution introduces another failure mode. That's not a failure of imagination. It's a success of realism. Cox often reminds people that realism is not pessimism. It's respect for limits. Ignoring limits doesn't make them disappear. It makes consequences sharper. Which brings us to the most quietly devastating implication. If we cannot simply go back to the moon, if doing so requires rebuilding entire industrial ecosystems, if it demands permanent sacrifice from the humans involved, if it offers no real safety, no independence, no scalability, then the Apollo era wasn't the beginning of expansion. It was the peak of a very specific moment. A moment where humanity briefly touched an environment it does not belong to, and survived only because it left. That's the part people don't like to hear. Apollo worked because it ended. If Apollo had tried to stay, it would have failed. Not heroically, not dramatically, slowly, quietly, system by system. And the moon would not care. Cox's perspective strips the romance away, but leaves something more valuable in its place: clarity. The moon is not humanity's future. It is humanity's boundary. A reminder that intelligence does not guarantee adaptability. That technology does not erase biology. That ambition does not override physics. And that brings us to the final pressure point. If going back to the moon isn't about settlement, isn't about survival, isn't about expansion, then why does it still matter? That question doesn't end the argument. It sharpens it, because the answer has nothing to do with living there, and everything to do with understanding ourselves. By now, the moon has stopped being a destination and started acting like a question. Not a technical one, but a philosophical one, the kind that physics quietly forces on you whether you like it or not. If the moon cannot host us, cannot save us, cannot scale with us, then its real role in human history isn't expansion, it's revelation. Brian Cox often frames space exploration not as a story of conquest, but as a story of self-discovery under extreme constraints. Space doesn't show us what we can become. It shows us what we already are, stripped of illusions. And nowhere does that become clearer than when we talk about going back. Because back implies ownership, familiarity, continuity. But the moon is not continuous with human life. It never was. Apollo didn't prove that humans belong on the moon. It proved the opposite, that we can only survive there by importing Earth, fragment by fragment, inside sealed metal bubbles. Every breath on the moon is borrowed. Every drop of water is recycled. Every calorie is planned. Every failure is terminal. Cox points out that environments like this don't just challenge engineering, they challenge meaning. Human societies evolved around abundance, variability, and redundancy. Nature makes mistakes, and life adapts. On the moon, mistakes compound. There is no margin for cultural drift, no room for inefficiency, no tolerance for error. That creates a form of existence closer to life aboard a submarine than life on a planet, except submarines can surface. The moon cannot. And this is where the conversation quietly turns inward. If humans did establish a permanent lunar presence, who would it really be for? Not farmers, not families, not artists, not children. It would be for specialists, technicians, engineers, people trained to survive inside systems, not ecosystems. Cox is careful here, but the implication is stark. A permanent lunar population would not be a continuation of humanity as we know it. It would be a divergence, a branch optimized for containment. And containment, historically, does not produce thriving civilizations. It produces maintenance cultures, societies focused on keeping things from breaking rather than creating something new. Innovation requires waste. Culture requires slack. Freedom requires inefficiency. The moon allows none of these. So even if humans lived there, what would they be living for? This leads to one of Cox's most unsettling observations. Exploration and habitation are not the same goal, and confusing them leads to bad decisions. Exploration is temporary by design. It's about reaching limits, collecting information, and returning enriched. Habitation implies permanence, roots, generations. The moon supports the first, it resists the second. Apollo was successful because it respected that distinction. Modern narratives blur it. They speak of bases and cities and settlements as if survival alone justifies presence. But Cox argues that survival without flourishing isn't progress, it's endurance. And endurance is not what civilization is for. Civilization exists to expand possibility, not compress it. That's why the moon keeps defeating our language. Every time we describe it as a future home, physics quietly corrects us. No atmosphere, no biosphere, no geology that supports life, no magnetic field to protect it, no natural cycles to absorb stress. The moon is static, frozen, finished. Earth is dynamic, alive, self-repairing. Which brings us to the deeper irony. The more we study the moon, the more we learn about Earth. Lunar rocks tell us about planetary formation. Crater records tell us about cosmic violence. Orbital dynamics teach us about stability. The moon's value is not that we can live there, it's that it helps explain why we can live here. Cox often emphasizes that Earth is not just rare because of distance or chemistry, but because of balance. A balance we didn't design and cannot reproduce. The moon lacks that balance entirely. So the question, why can't we simply go back, transforms into something more honest. Why are we so desperate to believe we should? The answer has less to do with science and more to do with discomfort. Discomfort with limits. Discomfort with finitude. Discomfort with the idea that humanity might not be meant to spread endlessly. But Cox doesn't frame this as failure. He frames it as responsibility. If Earth is the only place where humans can truly thrive, not survive, but thrive, then abandoning it emotionally, even hypothetically, becomes dangerous. The fantasy of escape weakens the commitment to preservation. Why fix the planet if there's another one waiting? But there is. And the moon makes that painfully obvious. It sits there, close enough to see, close enough to reach, yet utterly unwilling to host us. Not as punishment, not as rejection, but as a fact. Physics doesn't negotiate. And that leads directly to the final turn of the argument. Because once you accept that the moon isn't a destination, once you stop asking how to go back, a different question takes its place. What was Apollo really for? And what does going back actually mean, if it isn't about staying? That question doesn't end here. By the time you reach the end of this question, something subtle has changed. The moon is no longer a place you're trying to get to. It's a mirror you're being forced to look into. Brian Cox often says that the most dangerous misunderstandings in science don't come from ignorance, they come from familiarity. From believing we understand something because we've seen it before. And nothing feels more familiar than the moon. We see it every night. We grew up with it in stories. We watched grainy footage of boots touching its surface. It feels conquered. But familiarity is not the same as mastery. What Apollo really demonstrated wasn't permanence. It demonstrated alignment, a brief moment when politics, funding, industry, culture, education, and risk tolerance all pointed in the same direction at the same time. Not because it was efficient, not because it was sustainable, but because it was urgent. The moon landing wasn't the natural outcome of technological progress. It was an anomaly. And anomalies don't repeat themselves just because we want them to. This is the part most people miss when they say we did it once, we can do it again. They imagine technology as a ladder where each rung stays in place forever, but real technological systems don't work that way. They're ecosystems. They require constant feeding, continuous practice, institutional memory, economic justification. Apollo consumed all of that and then vanished. Factories closed. Specialists retired. Supply chains dissolved. Knowledge fragmented. Priorities shifted. Not because anyone failed, but because the world moved on. And here's the uncomfortable truth Cox keeps circling. Progress doesn't accumulate automatically. It has to be maintained, and maintenance is far less glamorous than breakthroughs. Going back to the moon isn't impossible because we lack rockets. It's impossible because the conditions that made Apollo rational no longer exist, and recreating them would require choices modern societies are unwilling to make. The costs aren't just financial, they're cultural. Apollo tolerated failure in a way we no longer do. It accepted risk at a scale we now find unacceptable. It prioritized symbolic achievement over efficiency. It burned resources without asking about return on investment. Today's world asks different questions. What's the payoff? Who benefits? What breaks if it fails? Why not do this robotically instead? And those questions are not wrong, they're evolved. Cox is careful not to romanticize the past. He doesn't argue that we should resurrect Apollo's mindset wholesale. He argues that pretending it was normal is a mistake. The moon didn't become unreachable. We became different, more cautious, more interconnected, more optimized, less willing to gamble lives for symbolism. That's not weakness, it's maturity. And this is where the meaning of never finally becomes clear. Never doesn't mean humans will never touch the moon again. It doesn't mean missions won't happen. It doesn't mean astronauts won't stand there once more. It means the Apollo version of the moon is gone forever. The version where a civilization pours absurd resources into a single goal simply to prove it can. The version where success is measured by flags and footprints. The version where speed matters more than sustainability. That era is over. And that's why the moon keeps receding, not physically, but conceptually. We don't go back because there is no back to go to. The moon has become something else, a boundary marker, a reminder of how far brute force can take you and where it stops being useful. Modern space exploration reflects this shift. We build probes, not monuments, telescopes, not cities. We listen more than we launch. We observe rather than occupy. This isn't retreat, it's precision. Cox often emphasizes that the deepest achievements in science don't come from planting flags, but from understanding structure. And the structure of the universe is not optimized for human expansion. It's optimized for stability, longevity, and indifference. The moon doesn't care if we return. Mars doesn't need us. Space isn't waiting. That realization changes everything. It reframes Earth not as a stepping stone, but as the central achievement. Not a starting point, the destination. If humans ever return to the moon, it won't be because we're repeating history. It will be because we've decided, consciously, to rebuild an ecosystem of effort for a purpose that justifies the cost. And that purpose won't be nostalgia. It will be science, perspective, understanding. The moon, stripped of fantasy, becomes what it always was, a classroom, not a home. And maybe that's the most honest ending of all. The greatest legacy of Apollo isn't that we touched the moon. It's that we learned, decades later, why touching it didn't mean owning it. The moon didn't move away from us. We grew up, and the universe noticed.